You can find the report we'll be discussing today on our website at www.bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can also find there a lot of our other work, including our recent explainer on birthright citizenship, our blogs looking at the changing demographics of migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, and an Immigration 101 link for many more explainers on key topics of the immigration debate. You can also find links there to our podcast, This Week in Immigration, where we break down the latest news in immigration policy and politics in an easy-to-digest half-hour format. You can subscribe to that podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Just search for Bipartisan Policy. A reminder that we will be taking questions for our panelists at the end of our presentations and some discussion. You can tweet your questions to us via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive, or you can send us an email at bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. So start thinking of your questions. Remember, the hashtag is BPCLive on Twitter or bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org, and I'll give another reminder before we turn to Q&A toward the end of our presentations. Feel free to submit those at any time during the webcast, and we will get to them at the end. So now let me introduce our speakers. Ann Morse is the director of the Immigrant Policy Project in the Washington, D.C. office of the National Conference of State Legislatures. She started there in 1987. She also staffs the NCSL Executive Committee Task Force on Immigration in the states. These initiatives provide state lawmakers with research and analyses on federal immigration policy, state and local innovative programs, and state legislation related to immigrants. Margie McHugh is director of the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. The center is a national hub for leaders in government, community affairs, business, and academia to obtain the insights and knowledge they need to respond to challenges and opportunities today's high rates of immigration pose for communities across the United States. And Cristobal Ramon, who is the principal author of the report we'll be discussing today, is a policy analyst with our BPC Immigration Project. Chris is a former Fulbright Scholar in Spain, a graduate of George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he focused on comparative U.S.-EU immigration. And before joining BPC, he served as a research consultant on immigration integration issues with the National Immigration Forum, and also interned at the Migration Policy Institute, the German Marshall Fund's migration program, and the U.S. Helsinki Commission. So BPC has been partnering with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the National Association of Counties over the last year in a project to understand how immigration affects and how immigration issues are being handled by states and localities across the country. What lessons especially might be learned for the national immigration debate. As part of this project, we took a look at a database compiled by the National Conference of State Legislatures of all state-enacted legislation dealing with immigration since 2005. We wanted to understand the ways in which partisanship has impacted state immigration legislating and whether there are areas of bipartisanship that can be brought to the national debate. The culmination of that work is the report that we're releasing today, An Immigration Patchwork of the States: How Partisanship, Regionalism, and Shifting Priorities Impact State Immigration Laws. To start, Chris will give us an overview of the report and its findings, and then we'll turn to our two guests for a bit of broader discussion on the involvement of state legislatures in immigration issues. And after that, we will turn to your questions. So again, be sure to tweet using hashtag BPCLive or send an email to bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. So Chris, why don't you get us started and tell us about the report?
Yeah, so thank you once again to Margie and to Ann for joining us today. I am a former, very proud MPI intern alum, so it's nice to be working with Margie again and to be working with Ann. So let's get started on the presentation. Next slide. So we're going to just do a quick executive summary of the overall points from the report, and then we'll dig in deep a little bit into the findings from the report before wrapping up with a conclusion. Next slide. So broadly, what we've seen in our report is that more states have weighed in on the immigration debate by passing more state immigration laws. Now, when it comes to partisanship, states have really seen a lot of divides between Republican and Democratic governments, passing laws that have high levels of policy divergence. And at the same time, with this partisanship that we've been seeing that's been influencing the development of these laws, this has also been reinforced by the national parties and the positions that they've taken over time, and the way that those positions can change or consolidate over time as well. Next slide. But what we've also found is that there are factors that can blunt the impact of partisanship. Some of them are apolitical factors at the state level, like employer demand for foreign workers, and some of them are also party regionalism, where you see parties in different parts of the United States, state governments from parties that really adopt laws that are a little bit different from their other counterparts in the other region that are actually more similar to the other side of the aisle. So Democratic governments passing more conservative legislation that's a little bit more like Republican governments and the legislation that they pass, and then Republican governments passing slightly more progressive legislation that's similar to what Democratic parties have passed, or Democratic state governments have passed. So basically, the conclusion is that there are limits to partisanship, and that this really points to areas of consensus for immigration reform at the federal level. So let's just dig in deep into the findings. Broadly, more states have been passing more immigration laws, and this chart right here gives you a good sense of the fact that more states have been weighing in. What you saw between 2005 and 2007, you saw a significant increase in the number of states that have been passing more laws, and this has largely been sustained over the last couple of years. Next slide. More states have also been passing more laws, and we've been seeing significant peaks, particularly in 2015 when you had 221 laws that were passed. But there have been other peaks that we've seen over the last decade, and 2017 was another notable year in high numbers of activities, high number of laws that were passed. Next slide. Now, in terms of the states that have produced the most laws, California has completely outperformed all the other top 10 states. The state has largely driven the largest volume of immigration laws in the top 10 states. And in fact, in the report, we have a chart that you see sort of California increasing the number of legislation that's passed, and the other top 5 states kind of decreasing. And the overall output really mirrors what California is doing. So California is the leader on this area. Now, when you're looking at, next slide, when you look at the categories of laws that have been passed, the top 3 categories that have been passed by these states, one is IDs and driver's licenses. So these are laws that tend to regulate non-citizen access to driver licenses and other types of licenses. Some of these restrict access, some of these expand access, and that's one key area. The second area is budgets, and budgets means that state governments allot funding for state and local programs that promote immigrant integration, but sometimes also immigration enforcement depending on the state. And the last area that's a top 3 area is law enforcement. This is really significant because it's been getting the most attention. These are laws that promote or limit state and local cooperation with immigration enforcement authorities. So this has been getting a lot of press. California passed a sanctuary bill last year, and Texas passed an anti-sanctuary bill that's been getting a lot of press. So this is an area that's been getting national attention. Next slide. So if you look at sort of also the times that these laws have been passed and in higher numbers, it sort of correlates where the national immigration debate lies. One example is with immigration enforcement legislation. You saw more of these laws being passed in 2010 and 2011 when Arizona passed SB 1070, which was the stringent immigration enforcement laws. Other Republican states passed similar laws, and that increased overall output. So that's one example where it mirrors the immigration debate. It's also worth noting that sometimes federal legislation, so for instance, the Real ID Act of 2005, prompted state governments to pass more driver's licenses laws because the new federal law allowed them to basically expand non-citizen access to driver's licenses. So, this activity tends to parallel the immigration debate, but also some federal legislation as well. Next slide. Partisanship. So let's look at partisanship and the impact it had on these laws. Broadly, what we found is that all Democratic, so when we say all Democratic, we're talking about state governments where the Democrats control the governor's mansion and both chambers of the state legislature, or all Republican, which is once again, the Republican Party controls all levers of state government, have passed very different sets of laws in key areas. This is really just the parties taking very different stances on immigration. And what we've also seen is that the national parties and the positions that they've taken over time reinforces this partisanship. So these are the two factors that have been playing together to promote partisanship and basically divide in immigration policies enacted by these governments. Next slide. So this slide just gives you a basic overview that, there has been a lot of activity from both of these governments. Republican governments have been a little bit more active than Democratic governments during this period, but they've all been really active, in, just like other states, in weighing in on the debate. Next slide. So this is where we start going into the divides. If you look at enforcement legislation, all Republican governments have passed significantly more enforcement legislation than all Democratic governments. And what you've seen in particular, that 2010 to 2011 boost came out from Arizona SB 1070. But these enforcement legislations are really either they promote state and local cooperation with federal immigration authorities, and sometimes they actually target employers who hire undocumented immigrants, for instance. So once again, all Republican governments have really been leading on this area. Next slide. By conversely, what you look at with all Democratic governments, more integration legislation. This is legislation that expands public benefits for non-citizens, including undocumented immigrants, driver's licenses, or that limits cooperation between state and local authorities and federal authorities. So this divide is really significant, and this chart really brings that out. Next slide. Next slide. And so when you look at prior slide. So with shifting priorities, this is also something that's important, especially with the Democratic Party. The National Democratic Party has largely shifted towards a more pro-immigrant stance that started in 2008, but definitely picked up after 2011. And that actually influenced the types of laws that all Democratic governments were passing at the state level. If you look at 2011, the total number of integration output from all Democratic governments really just spiked, while enforcement dropped off. And I think that this is really reflective of sort of how the National Democratic Party has been adjusting its overall position, and that impacted all Democratic state governments, reinforcing that partisanship. Next slide. Conversely, with all Republican governments, they were kind of leading the charge a little bit on immigration enforcement, that then was sort of picked up by the National Republican Party, and they sort of embraced this harder edge immigration position. And that then subsequently reinforced what was happening at the state level with all Republican governments. So it was really a little bit more around consolidation around immigration enforcement as a key policy priority for the National Republican Party and state all Republican governments. Next slide. Now, there are, though, very significant limits on partisanship and the impact on state immigration laws. So, for instance, one of the key areas is employer demand for foreign workers. What we found is all Republican and all Democratic governments both passed laws that made it easier for employers to hire foreign workers or individuals with foreign credentials. Largely, these are licensed professions where they can weigh in on that, but this is an area of convergence. And there's also regional variations where you see basically parties, so all Democratic state governments, they're not all the same. And in fact, in the Southeast, they tended to pass more conservative legislation compared to their counterparts in the rest of the country. Meanwhile, Mountain State Republicans, which are a little bit more progressive in some areas, have been passing more progressive legislation that mirrors Democratic legislation in other states. Let's just take a look at an example of these laws. So this is an example of all Democratic state immigration employment laws. And what you can see here is what these laws tend to do is they just adjust licensing requirements that makes it easier for employers to contract workers, primarily in the healthcare field, which is one area that we did see this, but in other licensed professions as well. Next slide. But this is where it gets really interesting. All Republican governments have passed very similar legislation that adjusts licensing requirements. And some of these examples are really just ruby red states. Arizona passed this law that's on this chart. In 2010, the same year, it passed SB 1070, a very stringent enforcement law. Louisiana, another very conservative state, passed a similar type of legislation in 2015. Utah, which is a little bit more progressive, did the same thing in 2015. But overall, you see just very similar laws. Now, if you're looking at regional variations, this is once again where we start seeing some interesting patterns. Democratic governments in southeastern states tended to pass much more conservative legislation, especially in immigration enforcement. And largely this was happening towards 2008-2010 before we were talking about the shifting priorities at the national level, before that occurred, and before a wave of Republican victories in state houses and governorships happened a couple of years later. So that's worth noting. Next slide. Mountain state all-Republican governments, though, have been a little bit more progressive in some areas as well, sometimes expanding identification cards for undocumented immigrants, for instance, in Utah. And so this is actually tends to parallel a little bit what's been happening with other all-democratic governments in other parts of the country. So regional variations, this party regionalism really does have an impact on sort of bringing more convergence between the two parties. So next slide. So the conclusion. Next slide. Basically, as we've been saying, state-level partisanship does have a real impact on the types of laws that all Democratic and all Republican governments have passed. This is very real. It's, and it's expected in a lot of ways. Two parties definitely have different positions that they take, and that's, what we'll expect to see. But state-level and regional factors have definitely blunted the impact of partisanship, especially with employment legislation, for instance, but in other areas as well. And so I think that this area of convergence really points to areas of bipartisan consensus between the two parties here in DC for federal immigration reform or legislation. There is one thing I want to leave on the note, though, is that as you've been seeing the nationalization of the debate about state immigration policies, especially around enforcement in these states, and you've been seeing the national immigration debate and the polarization that's been filtering down to the state level, the question is whether or not these areas of convergence can continue to exist as the debate and the polarization starts coming to the state houses and in the counties as well. So, it's an open question, can this survive? And I think that's a question that remains to be seen and where things are going to go. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So let's ask a couple of questions. So after doing this deep dive into legislation and a lot of work, I have to commend you and the team of folks who worked on this report, because you took the list of bills that NCSL had, but then you had to go research every state and the composition, the party composition of the governorship and the assemblies in that state at the time that law was passed. So you did that for how many laws were total?
I think we looked up something in the ballpark of 1,400 laws. So there were 2,100 laws that have been passed between 2005 and 2017. We looked at ballpark about 1,300 to 1,400 state immigration laws. 1,300
to 1,400. So what was, aside from the findings you hear, what to you was the most surprising thing that you found in looking at this?
Yeah, one of the things I didn't get to talk about with regionalism is something that I've been calling the no touchback rule. What you see is these conservative southeastern all-democratic governments, they pass these enforcement laws, and then the successive wave of all Republican governments that tend to replace them don't touch those laws. And in fact, they just kind of sit there and they kind of let them sit on the books, largely because they have the same policy position as their Democratic predecessors. And this is really interesting because what you're hearing is sometimes is advocates are saying, well, we're going to look at a state like Tennessee, which has gone through some of that transition. And the idea that they can sort of change what's already in the books, I think isn't necessarily as feasible, because in a lot of ways, the Democrats that were in power passed laws that were already there, and then Republicans just came in and just said, we like this. We're not going to touch it. And so I think that this pattern of seeing where there was a continuation of policies, or at least a continuation of policy consensus between Democratic and Republican governments in the Southeast is really something that really impressed me quite a bit, and just sort of seeing the consistency of the pattern that we saw there.
So you also mentioned, and you mentioned in your presentation, sort of the nationalization of some of these state immigration efforts. So you have national groups, advocacy groups on both sides of the immigration issue who have gone into states to try to push the state legislators to pass either more integrative or more enforcement-related immigration laws. Based on what you see here, what do you think is looking in the future? Do you think those strategies are likely to be successful? Do you think that based on what you see, are the conditions for a Tennessee, for example, to turn and pass more integrative legislation, or perhaps the opposite?
I think advocates who want to walk into these states and who are more have a pro-immigrant stance, they want to pass more progressive legislation, are going to find a lot of resistance outside of California. you know, they tend to look at California as an example, but California is really unique. It's, you know, straight blue. It's been blue since, you know, Jerry Brown was elected governor, and they've been really putting out a lot of really pro-immigration laws. But the moment you start getting out of California and a small smattering of blue states, this no touchback principle kind of comes into effect. It's a little bit harder to switch states that have a large number of enforcement laws, like Tennessee, for instance, that not only came from Republican governments, but also Democratic ones as well. So the challenges that they're going to be facing is really, A, how many laws do they have to sort of overact, but then these governments tend to remain pretty conservative, and they have to sort of be able to take into account, you know, the political topography of each state that they're walking into. States or advocates who tend to be maybe a little bit more conservative and want to pass more pro-enforcement legislation, for instance, might have a little bit more success, you know, with all Republican governments. You know, we saw that with SB 1070. We saw that a little bit with SB 4 in Texas. That was the anti-sanctuary bill that was passed last year. But the question, of course, is what's going to happen now that we've had the midterm elections, that we've seen some flipping of state houses, and will there be more success or less success for either pro-immigrant advocates or advocates who want to promote immigration enforcement, for instance?
Thank you very much, Chris. And this is a perfect opportunity to bring you in. So you've been working with these state legislators for a long time. Talk to us a little bit about the work of the NCSL task force. You know, what is it? How did it come about? What is the role the task force plays, and what sort of issues do your members really engage in?
Well, thank you first to the Bipartisan Policy Center for introducing the work today and for finding our database of interest. It's always a delight that somebody actually looks at a database, looks to some facts. So it's been a pleasure working with Teresa and Chris this past year and getting a deeper sense of the partisanship, the regionalism, and some of the areas that we haven't looked at over time within NCSL. I did want to just mention that we review close to 1,400 bills every single year through StateNet to see which ones are relevant and what the big changes are, and trying to get a sense of trends, and we'll talk about the website at the end of the program. I want to say working with the Task Force on Immigration in the States at NCSL has been really insightful as to why some of these trends occur. And I want to start with the fact that it's a bipartisan task force, evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, and when you hear our members converse about immigration issues, you often cannot tell which party they are, because they're there to find consensus. They're there to find common ground, common sense solutions. We were created in 2005, 2006 by our NCSL's leadership, Senator Vanderpute of Texas and Senator Rauschenberger of Illinois, to help advance national immigration reform, help bring some light to the heat, and try to work with states to identify best practices they could do in their states. And that's why we saw a lot of beginnings around developing in-state tuition laws, driver's license laws, professional licenses, which is the most recent and interesting trend, because looking broader picture at the nation's economy, as you see the baby boomers retire, up to 10,000 people a day turn 65, state legislators are looking at their economy down the road. And what does that mean to plug into the places where these workers are leaving? We have seen a lot of concern about shortages of teachers, shortage of doctors and nurses, and how can state legislators find talent within their borders that's already there, that's legally authorized to work, but not working at the top of their capacity. So I think that's one area that we'd be looking at. I'm going to stop there because you have more questions.
Sure. Well, talk a little bit about some of the successes of the task force. They're reaching bipartisan conclusions, and you talked about that. You know, how do they work? It's interesting that you know, Chris did the numbers and crunched the numbers and found, gee, they're looking at workforce, and you're like, I know that because they've been telling me that. What are some other areas that that is really top of mind for them right now?
Let me start with driver's licenses. So, for example, many states offer driver's licenses because they issue those documents to immigrants in their state, and the concern is making sure that they know how to drive and that they have insurance. And so a Utah legislator, Senator Bramble, was one of the first to look at this issue and say, we're having accidents in the state and we're having problems being able to pay for the results of those accidents, and the federal government isn't going to deport them. So we have de facto amnesty, and until they do something about immigration laws, we in the state can extend driver's licenses to these individuals and make sure they're insured. And in fact, after the law passed, they found that these individuals who were unauthorized were getting insurance for their automobiles at the same rate as those born in Utah. So that's a success story. Right next door, Senator Dennis of Nevada saw the need to copy that legislation and adapt it his state, and Senator Bramble came to talk to the members and said, this is how we passed it, this is how we overcame obstacles, and Nevada also passed with one dissenting vote driver's license law in their state to extend driving authorization cards.
So that's very interesting that through your task force, legislators get a chance to see and hear directly from legislators in other parts of the country the issues they've been working on, the way that they have talked about it and the way they got it adapted in their state. And so there's a lot of lessons learned and sharing there of information about how to do these things.
It's a good peer-to-peer learning opportunity, and you can see what's working in your state, what the economic demands are in your state, and you adapt ideas for what is appropriate for your resources and your population. One of the other areas that has been interesting is, as we're talking about professional licenses, we spend a lot of time looking at fiscal and economic impacts at the state level and how do you capitalize on talent that you have. So states are looking at ways to streamline or overcome small obstacles. And we'll start with California. California was one who looked at their legislation and said, why are we asking for a Social Security number if all we need is identification? So they're using the individual taxpayer identification number on application forms for licenses instead of a Social Security number. So people who are qualified, who meet all the tests, and otherwise couldn't because of this one law, one regulation, they overcame that, and now they're having success in getting people into professional fields.
So you mentioned the Utah state legislator looked very pragmatically at what was going on in the state and said, look, we have people, they may not have immigration status, but they're driving, and the costs of these uninsured drivers are accruing to me in our state. And if the federal government's not going to do anything about this, which they haven't, then it's up to us to legislate what's going on here. So to what extent do you think is a lot of this happening because the federal government has not been, either enforcing or legislating, or, we talk a lot about gridlock in Washington, the immigration system, we've been working on this for a long time, Congress still hasn't passed anything. What do you hear from your members about, they're taking action because of federal inaction? Would they like to see more federal action? What are they saying?
Absolutely, the members would like to see more federal action. We've come so close federally, 2005, 2007, 2013, possibly more efforts to try to get, and this past year, to try to get immigration issues resolved at the national level. There is a limit to what state legislators can address. That doesn't stop them from finding good solutions and would like to offer better solutions to our federal counterparts. Come to our states, come see what's working, and let's help solve the problem together.
So how do you help Washington hear more of these state voices in immigration? What do we need to do to have the state voices heard more?
Well, I think state legislators are already visiting their delegations. I think there could be room for regional sharing of experiences. One thing I'd like to look more at how immigrants are affecting rural areas. So several of our task force members have highlighted for us in places we didn't expect, labor shortages, where they really need, say, nurses in rural areas, or they need workers in poultry plants where they're just not available workers already within the state. So trying to navigate those kinds of needs, along with protecting public safety, I think that's something we can come to a common sense balance on.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Chris did mention that there were some flips in the state house last week with the election. Do you have any data on, sort of where the outcomes of state races? Yeah, we've been focused all on Congress here in Washington,
Yes.
but tell us about what's been happening in the state races.
So NCSL state vote happened last Friday. If you go and search for NCSL state vote, you'll find what I'm telling you. But the essence is voters in 46 states chose more than 6,000 state legislators last election, 80% of all seats in the country. Democrats flipped more than 330 state legislative seats, but unusually we saw the fewest chamber switches in 3 decades. On average, 12 chambers changed party hands in every 2 election cycle, dating back to 1900. 6 Republican-led chambers did switch to Democrat: the Colorado Senate, Connecticut Senate, both houses in New Hampshire, the Minnesota House, and the Maine Senate. Democrats also took control of the tied Connecticut Senate. And just touching on the ballot, Oregon, I think, was the only state in the country that had an immigration-related ballot initiative, and the sanctuary repeal that was on the ballot failed. We continue to see there's interest from our members. During that state vote discussion, Senator Ruiz from New Jersey talked about undocumented licenses in New Jersey, an effort to come forward next year, and Senator Wagle of Kansas said that immigration needs to be fixed.
So I remember when Chris was looking at the state data, there are some anomalies year to year because some state houses meet only every other year. Texas being probably the most salient for this conversation because Texas passes a lot of immigration legislation. They're coming into session this year. Have you had a chance, or have you heard what may be coming up in the Texas legislature?
I haven't gone deeply into it, but there are a lot of pre-files already, and a number of them will look at what we have been seeing. So areas such as sanctuary cities or cooperation with federal authorities or public charge issues. I don't go deeply into that just yet because it's just been a week. But we will be tracking that and be reporting soon.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And now we turn to Margie McHugh, who is joining us from California. Thank you very much for joining us, Margie. So you work extensively studying immigrant integration efforts, and Chris talked a little bit about places where there may be partisan divergence, but tell us where and what particularly do you see states engaging in immigrant integration efforts at the state level?
Great, thanks, Teresa. And sorry I couldn't be there in DC for this. It's really a privilege to be both with BPC and NCSL for such a rich conversation about what states are doing on such a wide range of issues. I think because of where I sit, or my piece of the work being focused on integration, unlike a lot of my national level colleagues, I just feel that states are so deep into so many issues related to the impacts of immigration in their states. And I guess the broadest way to look at it is to think about what states mostly do or spend their money on, and for sure that involves education pipeline issues, especially K-12, elementary and secondary education. Also implementation of a wide range of health and human services programs, and then in the education and workforce side, as Anne was saying, these states are worrying all the time about the vitality of their economies, how they're going to survive, both with the demographic changes in the country in terms of having a really productive workforce and economy, and then also as the economy continues to globalize, how to stay out in front of some of those trends. And so the way I see the map of the country is actually that there's often so much agreement and sense of common purpose about how to work on those issues in terms of helping immigrant and refugee families be very productive parts of where states are trying to go in terms of talent development, making sure that all of their young people are graduating from high school ready for college, and also that they're helping people to skill up now that we're in an economy where people are going to have several different, practically careers, never mind jobs, over the course of their work lives, how to really build adult education and workforce training systems that can be responsive to all of their workers. So when I look at the map, it includes very much these issues that are controversial, that are very evident in the work that you're showcasing today, and where states diverge. But at the same time, there's so much money being moved into K-12 systems, for example, to help address the needs of students who were English language learners, and also into adult education systems, try and help immigrants and refugees learn English and be able to move up in the workforce. That because states are so pragmatic and really are trying to look ahead at what sort of a brighter future is there for all of their residents, that are, I would have to say, they're, I'm not being Pollyannish, of course. There is a concern that the federal government just thinks about numbers and categories of immigrants and not about all these local impacts. But I would say everywhere across the country, red or blue states, you can see so many state administrators and legislators really putting their shoulder to the wheel to try and figure out how to build a more successful and common future.
So Margie, let me ask you this. Do you see a difference, for example, everyone talks about California when they talk about state immigration legislation. Of course, California is home to more immigrants than any other state in the nation and has done a lot here. But you're talking about other states that may not have so many immigrants, and that's actually maybe why they're looking at this, like if states that are looking at workforce population loss and things like that. Are they weighing in more on some of these issues and looking at immigrants as potential helping to sustain or rebuild workforces that they may otherwise lose?
You know, I've been in the field for a long time, so I guess maybe part of how I look at that is that I think one of the dynamics that we've all lived through is that maybe 20 years ago, immigration was really just a 5-state issue. It was a big deal for the big gateway states, New York, Florida, Illinois, California, and Texas. But then over the last 20 years, it's become more of a 40-state issue. And part of the kind of pain point of it becoming a 40-state issue was that many of those states, first of all, didn't have the skill set that the traditional immigrant receiving states had built over 100 or 125 years. And they also very often were low social investment states. You know, they did not have very generous Medicaid programs, for example, or they did not spend as much per pupil on K-12 education. And in a sense, what the states were hoping to do was just to have narrow fixes and a narrow definition of economic development, which was bringing in jobs very often that were not really sort of good jobs that you could help families advance up into the middle class, for example. And they didn't anticipate that by bringing in workers that they were really bringing in immigrant families, not just workers. And so I think where we're at now is that states are they've learned. There's been a trajectory of learning, and I think lots of states are thinking in a different way about how to more holistically think about economic development and think about the role of immigration in that. And so I think the early stages of that are partly these issues of looking at licensing laws, and where we have some wind in our sails on the licensing question is that it's a really big issue for military families also.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's other sort of motivators for looking at some of these issues. In order to keep talented people in the military, very often their spouses are highly educated and they have the same trouble that immigrants do in trying to be relicensed in a new state. And so I think that there's a broader look at the role that some of this overregulation, the problems that it's causing, and questions about whether it really is protecting public health and safety to have these licensing regulations, or is it really just a means of reducing competition unfairly? And so anyway, so I think I would say that that states are thinking more and more about what kind of immigration policies and immigrant integration investment policies they want to see from the federal government as more of a partnership in terms of how to even push up into the national immigration conversation. That we all need to be thinking about impacts, and that it's the difficulty of any system trying to think about responses to issues that cross-cut. Almost every government is good at top-down, trying to do siloed things, but when you have to look at a policy that cuts across maybe a dozen other domestic policies, we really can see that we don't have the brain circuitry between the states and the federal government for really thinking about how to be in productive partnership around a balanced immigration and integration policy. But I think there's so much knowledge there now that it's inevitable that we'll be bringing more of it together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and one point you made early on there is that, you know, it's now a 40-state issue, where it used to be a 5-state issue, and Chris found that as well in looking at the number of states annually. You know, last couple of years, almost every state, 48, 49 states are passing laws on a regular basis. So everybody seems to be engaging now. I just want to remind our viewers, if you have a question for any of the panelists about the report or anything we're discussing, please use Twitter and hashtag BPC Live, or you can again email that to bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. We'll be turning to those questions shortly, but I have a couple more for the panel. Margie, I know that one area you mentioned that a lot of states are looking at is the refugee populations, both in terms of workforce, but states have a fairly significant role in the resettlement of those refugees that the U.S. government decides to resettle in the United States. There was some controversy around that, if you remember, in the last years of the Obama administration with the resettlement of Syrian refugees. Some governors weighed in and said, wait a minute, we don't necessarily want to have some of these refugees in our states. Obviously, the Trump administration took it in a different direction when they came in with their refugee policy. But where do you see states right now in refugee resettlement, and how are they engaging?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because I don't think a lot of people saw it coming, the ways in which the refugee resettlement program was going to be destabilized, because for so many years that was a source of pride for the country, and honestly for so many states that were very proud of the role they were playing in refugee resettlement. I think that, as you alluded to, it became, unfortunately, a bit of a political football in the late months of the Obama administration, with the decision to up the cap of individuals who would be brought in in order to let in more Syrian refugees. And then that became a very big issue in the Trump-Clinton campaign, where Hillary Clinton was very much on the side of higher refugee numbers and pitching in a sense, with the Syrian refugee crisis. Candidate, now President Trump, was very much against that with a public security argument. Many governors then jumped in on that. I think it was over 24 governors and state legislatures that then said that they did not want any of these Syrian refugees resettled in their states. So that was sort of the kind of spark, or the flame that was lit, that's brought us now to this point where the number has been greatly reduced. We're now down to just a 30,000 person cap this year, which is the lowest ever, I think, for the resettlement program. But honestly, I think that we really were not listening at the federal level to some of the concerns that states had, especially as the refugee program was bringing in more and more high-need individuals, that a number of states where, again, they were some of the states that had never had high rates of immigration. Refugees were going there largely because of cheap housing, or being brought there largely because of cheap housing. And then Tennessee, in fact, is the state that brought a constitutional challenge to the refugee program, saying, you're actually forcing us to use our state budget money, and it's tens of millions of dollars, to be providing both K-12 education services and health services to these populations. And that's actually that's a taking of federal, of state money and state authority. And so I think that has really blown open this conversation about, well, if this program is a national responsibility, why aren't the costs of it shared equally across every taxpayer in the country? Why do they fall more to people in a particular state where refugees have to be resettled? So we don't even have the mechanisms to really have that debate at the federal level, I would argue, and that a lot of these concerns weren't really being mediated. And so now, with the number being greatly reduced, and also with the bit of money that the federal government provides to states to provide, really fill gaps in terms of what might be missing in terms of supporting refugee integration, that money has to be split with the very few states that are receiving large numbers of asylum seekers. So I really worry about what's ahead for us in terms of states feeling exhausted, because they do have refugee coordinators. They're very active and very innovative, but the share of money that they're getting from the federal government to fill gaps is getting smaller and smaller at a time when refugee resettlement agencies are closing up in many parts of the country, because the low number of individuals coming in, they're also losing a lot of their staff. So I do think that we need to pay a lot more policy attention at the federal level, but that needs to be very much in consultation with states about how to have a system that truly has an appropriate level of partnership and support from the federal government for states.
So I want to bring Anne back in here, because Margie, you said on something very important here about states bearing the burden sometimes of federal immigration policies, and I'm sure that your members talk a lot about federalism and maybe burden sharing. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are they saying about the costs to states? And sometimes, I mean, obviously immigrants bring benefits too, but there are costs that are only borne at the state level, education probably being the biggest cost to states. How are they dealing with that, and what are they telling their federal government about what they would like to see in terms of burden sharing, if you will, for that, if that's the phrase used?
Yeah, if I can start with the refugee program. The refugee resettlement program actually started unofficially before 1980, when the Refugee Act was passed, when President Ford asked states to step forward and accept Southeast Asian refugees who were helping us in the war. And Iowa was the first to do so, and continued as a refugee resettlement agency itself for many, many years. So I think there was a shared responsibility at this point that this was a national interest and something that states could participate in, and a program that works miracles on a shoestring. The program has not seen an increase in dollars related to cash, medical assistance, other integration kinds of supports since 1982. That's a long time to go without much reform. So I think what state legislators were trying to say is we need to address this archaic system, make it a little more effective, make the cost sharing more fair, and be more encourage more consultation with those who are doing this on the front lines. Moving into the immigration piece of it, I think that members really want to say, we are trying pilot things in different states, let us show you what's working, and let's include that in the federal legislation and work together to get this done finally.
Thank you very much. All right, so we have a few questions, so we'll start with some of the questions that we've received, if we can see the first question here. There we go. Okay, so here's the first question. How do divergent state laws impact immigrants and their families? In other words, are there unique challenges living and working in different states and so on? So Chris, one of the things you noted is that, because of the partisanship and how states are passing legislation, that may have some differences in how immigrants are basically living their lives in states that are Democratic controlled or Republican controlled.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of those instances is that, we have a study, a lit review coming out in a couple of months about, non-citizen use of public benefits. And in that lit review, there were several studies that showed that, states that had passed immigration enforcement measures, I believe Georgia or Alabama is one, that then prompted lower use of health benefits. So there is some peer-reviewed studies that show, at least with public benefit use, among non-citizens or individuals who may be related to them in states where they've passed stronger enforcement laws may be impacting the number of individuals who use those benefits. So I think that's one key area that we've been seeing in this. But obviously, if you have these employment laws, you're able to come in. Once again, the key thing to note with these employment laws is that they don't change the way that the legal migration system works for at the federal level. That doesn't change in any way, shape, or form. It just makes it easier for them to be able to integrate into the job market because they don't have to go through several hoops for being able to work there because their licensing, for instance, their credentials are a little bit different. And obviously those individuals will have a slightly easier time getting employment there, but obviously the federal government and immigration law does impact that as well.
Yeah, Margie, I know you've done a lot of work here. How do you see the different legislative actions taken by the states impacting the lived experiences of immigrants in those states across the country?
Yeah, I would say they're very significant. If you think I guess even just from an enforcement perspective, I think we're living in a period now where the differences are really palpable. If you look at our two largest immigrant receiving states, California and Texas, that the context of reception from a law enforcement perspective or state and local law enforcement cooperation with immigration authorities is completely different. They've gone in opposite directions. So, but then I think another one that might be very familiar to your viewers is also issues around post-secondary education and the question of whether unauthorized youth would have access to in-state tuition. This has been an issue that's been with us probably for almost 20 years. Anne would probably know better, but I think it even started with the 1996 immigration law that Congress was trying to say prevent states from allowing in-state tuition to young people who were unauthorized. And it's a really interesting example of some of what you've been pointing out with the study today, where you have some surprising instances of states that one normally thinks of as being very restrictionist when it comes to immigration, who are very supportive, or who have supported for a while now in-state tuition, meaning just a very reduced price tuition for post-secondary education for these young people. And I think it points to something that very rarely comes up in the national debate, but really underlies why there's more centrist support for something like a DREAM Act or status and pathway to citizen for these young people, and why it's always been the place where there was most agreement in Congress. And that is from a religious perspective on the right, and for other values that they hold very closely, the idea that we don't hold children responsible, that none of the great religions, none of the great legal systems since the beginning of human society have held children responsible for the actions of their parents. And so that's why you have states like this and other Republican states maintaining these in-state tuition laws. And I think it's what Anne experiences a lot in her job, that you're trying to solve problems when you're closer to the ground, and you're able to have a much more nuanced conversation at the state and local level about why you should or shouldn't do some of these things that seem wildly controversial at the national level, but really just seem to be moral, ethical, and good government when you're at the local level. So I think that's policies to look at in terms of the reception that immigrant and refugee families are living in right now, depending on what state they reside in.
Thank you. So that actually leads into one of our next questions. And Anne, I'm going to address this one to you. So we've seen lots of former governors and state legislators get elected to Congress in recent years. And as Margie said, at the state level, they tend to be much more pragmatic. They've got on-the-ground issues to deal with. How have they been at bringing that pragmatism to Congress? Have they been successful? What do your state legislators say? Do they talk to their former colleagues? And what are they hearing about that transition?
Well, as we discussed earlier, we come so close, but we don't get all the way. So one chamber will be successful getting through, and they'll come together with a big complex package, which takes time for everybody to get up to speed, because there's a lot of new members in Congress who may not have the experience that older members have. And so I think what needs to happen is delegations need to share their expertise with each other, regions perhaps need to share their expertise with each other. The complexity of national immigration reform is that we need reforms to bring our 1986 law into the 21st century. It has been an archaic system, and many of our members say, we know that we need to improve this. How do we work on it together? How do we get agricultural workers that we need? How do we get STEM workers that we need? And how do we grow our own workforce in the future? And all those things need to be tied together.
So let me ask you, how do you think state legislators can be more effective in that message and getting that to Washington? How can they help their colleagues bring some of that pragmatism to the fore?
If I can do my personal experience, is that you bring people to see sites on the ground, that seeing it yourself.
Get Washington out of Washington?
Get Washington out of Washington. We have done a number of visits to the border where they say, hey, this is way more complicated than I thought, and it's also more solvable than I thought. And the same thing happens when you're working with advocacy organizations who are teaching English, who are helping people get jobs. They're very effective, low-cost programs that can be emulated in other communities, and Congress could help seed some of that work.
So you mentioned that several state legislative chambers have flipped during the midterms. Do you think those present new opportunities for those states and addressing any of the legislation? Anne, I'll start with you and then maybe ask Chris from what he sees.
Yeah, looking at these states, I mean, they have very good experience in immigration already, so I think they will have the experience to go forward where they may not have addressed something already. I don't see major change with the efforts to work across the aisle.
That's good. Chris, what do you think?
New York is going to be interesting.
Yeah,
New York, I think, because New York, I don't think has ever had. When was the last time they had a unified Democratic government, if ever? Well,
yeah, there's sort of been a Republican coalition in one chamber that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be interesting to sort of see what this government does, because in that top 10, New York was not there, and so actually
New York is one of the largest immigrant states, and yet they haven't passed a lot of immigration laws.
I mean, one of those reasons is that New York City, the New York Office of Immigrant Affairs, has been very active, but Albany hasn't been that active at all. So it's going to be interesting to sort of see where the state government is going to go. on issues like with driver's licenses, for instance, or in-state tuition, things that might be considered, whether this is actually going to move forward. So I think really New York is going to be the state to really watch out for with this new,
And you just raised another issue that we're not probably going to address here because we're talking really about state level, but localities. And we've been also talking about a National Association of Counties, sort of where the states may or may not have been moving in immigration. A lot of the counties and cities are moving and vice versa. So that's something else that brings the challenges. Let's see, we have a couple of other things. Let's talk a little bit about, litigation. Yeah. Okay, here's one of our favorite conversations around here. Does the recent increase in litigation around federal level immigration laws and regulations have any impact on state level laws or put even more pressure on the states? So the one thing that comes to mind immediately in thinking about this question is the litigation over sanctuary policies. This is an area where everybody seems to be suing everybody. As I say often, we have the federal government suing states, we have states suing the federal governments, we have the states passing laws to overrule city governments, we have cities then suing their states over the laws that the states passed. This is just, in my mind, federalism run amok, and not how it's supposed to work. But thinking about some of the litigation that is going on, either Margie, let's start with you. Do you see any of the current litigation that is likely to affect state-based integration efforts?
Well, I was smiling as you were describing the question, just thinking it's the states that are bringing half the more than they're half of the litigation. So I do think that this is what the federal government is reaping because of its many years of inaction, that states have become more and more polarized, more and more opinionated. All their attorneys generals are talking left and right and bringing their own suits, whether it's about DACA or DAPA or some of the enforcement measures. And so I think what's extraordinary about this moment now is that because Congress abandoned, I totally agree with Ann, we were so close so many times, but unfortunately close doesn't count. And it's really the issue about the unauthorized that has driven so much of this polarization. And now it's simply, we have empowered states, empowered localities, and so it's going to be the courts and the states, I think, that are really the new players. And I think that they actually will drive some new policies. They're already preventing a lot of things that might otherwise have happened, which is its own set of impacts on states. And that I think Congress is going to have to meet an even higher bar than it ever had before in order to take back its role and its supremacy on immigration matters.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, in the national debate, we keep talking about how, immigration is a federal responsibility and federal immigration law rules. But as you've said, and as Ann has said, states have been involved in aspects of immigration policy for a very long time, and certainly forever have dealt with immigrants in their states and in their communities and dealing. So it's never actually really and truly been an exclusively federal issue. And yet we do have this division, if you will, right now. Both you and Ann mentioned that the federal government has not really been listening to the states that have raised issues about how that burden sharing is happening for a long time. And so resulting in what, as you said, maybe we take it to court if the government's not going to listen to us a lot more. And what do you think? What are you hearing from your folks? Is this the way they want it to be, or what do they prefer?
If we're looking specifically at sanctuary policy, I think what we're lacking is clarity and communication. States have a long history of working and cooperating with the federal government on criminal immigration law or criminal laws. But when you start getting to civil immigration law, that is an area where states do not want to engage. They have enough on their plate already with their existing criminal procedures and laws. So getting to the point where there's clarity about what does it mean that is a sanctuary city? Are you releasing criminals? No, states are not doing that. But what they are saying is we're not going to take somebody who has a driving violation and clog up the system for that kind of violation.
So it's being more pragmatic. Let's take, I think we have one more question, maybe two here. So looking at the results of this last election, and a lot of political pundits have been noticing this growing rural-urban divide in national politics. So how much does that extend to the states, and what challenges it raise for state level action on immigration? So this is what I like to shorthandedly call the issue of the blue dot in the red state and the red dot in the blue state. So we have a few of those in this country, and it does seem to be that that is impacting expectations in some way of which way a state might move on immigration-related legislation. Chris, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think this is really, really important to understand, particularly what's been happening in the Southeast, for instance, we've been talking about party regionalism. I think that definitely reflects the fact that you see parties, both first the Democrats and then subsequent Republican state governments, really reflecting more I think the positions of a lot of voters in rural areas that tend to want a little bit more immigration enforcement, a little bit of control over immigration, that then those individuals elect individuals that go into the state legislature. And of course, what you see then is the tiny blue dot is like the urban areas and suburban areas who send Democrats, or maybe slightly more conservative, but Democrats to the state legislature. And then you see the output of the laws tend to be a lot more conservative. But when people think about, maybe focusing on having states be more active on integrative measures, they think, well, a Memphis or a Nashville or an Atlanta can sort of change the dimension of these laws, but that urban-rural divide is going to exist, and especially in states that have a larger rural population, that's just going to continue impacting the type of laws that come out.
So one of the things looking at the election last week we saw is the difference in, for example, the outcome of the House versus the Senate, where a lot of urban and suburban and exurban districts flipped Republican to Democrat, but states that had larger rural areas, the statewide elections, we saw some more Republicans win, maybe by tighter amounts because the urban areas are flexing their muscles, but still there's more voters in all of that extensive rural area than necessarily in just the urban centers. And so, just in terms of the federal election. And what about your members? I mean, you have members, I'm sure, that represent rural areas and urban areas. How do they see commonalities? How do they talk about these issues, or do you see some divisions in how they look at things?
Excuse me. Most often what I hear is excuse me, back to the labor issue. So Iowa has a new, sorry, I've got a tickle. Iowa, for example, has a new, I think it's a pork processing plant, and they had 3,000 jobs opening up, and they're already at full employment. So their response is, yes, but what do we do about the jobs that we have open? Places in rural areas that are attracting people to small towns that might be emptying out and moving to the south, that's an economic boon. So I think my members are pragmatic and nuanced, and they're trying to figure out how do we make the best outcome for everybody? How do we make sure that everybody's safe, well-educated, healthy, and working?
Marjorie, turning to you on this question. So rural areas tend to have less community resources to deal with immigrants who may come to their communities, both in terms of education or social services. And urban areas, usually, particularly ones that have had more of a history of receiving immigrants, may have just more capabilities there. How do you see that playing out in terms of newer immigrant receiving areas versus sort of some of the urban areas? And do you see tensions within the states on any of that?
When I had started my career in New York, and we had and I was based in New York City with my organization, and we would have some of the upstate, more rural communities actually coming down to Queens and trying to sponsor bus trips to try and get some immigrants to go en masse to settle in some of these less populated places of state. And so, so what I would say is that actually, as you were describing rural areas, they're often the places that most need immigrants. They need them for succession planning with farms, and they need them because of the so many folks who are aging in place, and there's simply no plan to provide some of the home care, for example, that's needed and the like. And so I think once you get over, if to the extent that there's cultural resistance to change in who the population in rural areas, I just think some of you have heard me talk about this, and I've written a little bit on it, but I really believe that we need an immigration policy where there's shared selection from the federal and state governments, because we cannot, how could we imagine that sprinkling in 1 million people a year around the country who are mainly selected by family members is going to meet the complex needs that these various regions of states have. And so to me, part of rebuilding agreement around immigration policy is to really hear the role that immigration could play in states and have the policy decision making go closer to the ground so that it can meet the specific needs that are going to be different, exactly as you're saying, in a rural area versus an urban area in a state.
Mm-hmm. So Anne, let me ask you this, because our last question is right on point here. So why not let states have more latitude on immigration policies? So going back, there have actually been a couple states that have experimented with trying to get the federal government to allow them to do selection. The Utah Compact is the one that comes to mind, and there's been some attempts at sort of getting Washington to maybe listen. I mean, we talk about the states being the laboratory of democracy, the laboratory of democracy in our country. Why not let them be the laboratory on immigration? Have your members talked about this? Is this an idea they think is worth considering?
So following the Utah example, the state of Utah did seek a guest worker waiver program, if you will, from the federal government, which it was never able to receive, specifically to be able to find the workers that it needed in its niche areas that it didn't have enough workers in. But that response wasn't forthcoming, and so that's an experiment that was not fulfilled. Like Canada's provinces are allowed to contribute to their national immigration system, so it's an idea that was of some interest. I think allowing states to have some pilot programs to demonstrate some success would be great, but at some level you have to have national visas. I mean, the federal government is the one responsible for admission and deportation of immigrants, and that needs to be uniform across the country. But let us see if we can't find areas where we're good.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to look at, as Margie said, our system right now, you know, 3/4 of the immigrants probably come in because they have a family member, they settle where that family member is. That tends to concentrate immigrants where they already are, not necessarily where they're needed economically. And so this might be something that Congress could look at in the future. I think we're just about out of time. Before we leave, I want to give Anne, where can people find you and your work and your organization? Give a plug for your website and Twitter handles and all of that.
Thank you, Teresa. I'll just send you the website, www.ncsl/IMMIG, IMIG.
IMIG, thank you. Margie, where can people find you and your work?
I think it's easiest to go via our website, which is migrationpolicy.org, and then /integration would be where all of our various information and project materials and the like have a home.
Great. And Chris, you are?
We're at www.bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration.
Yeah, and on Twitter you are?
At CRamonBPC. So you
right.
can follow me and
He tweets about all the work and writing he does. Very,
Exactly.
very prolific. You can find us also at BPC_bipartisan. I want to thank everyone who joined in for us today. If you still have questions, keep emailing them to the bpcinfo@bipartisanpolicy.org. We will try to see what we can do to answer them. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you will join us again for a future event. Thank you again.